Hey buddies, Mr. Pugly here, coming at you with another Wonderlands video. Today I want to show you this build that allows you to deal tons and tons of melee damage without actually meleeing. The basis around this is essentially making Executioner Blade deal as much damage as possible. But before we get into the meat and potatoes of the video, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and follow me on Twitch on the top right. You have no idea how much helps me out. And let's get into the video.
Legendary? Whoa! No way, dude!
So you guys saw at the beginning, I was essentially shooting my gun and then the enemies were just melting. The reason for this is because we're dealing a ton of damage with Executioner Blade, and then because we're dealing tons and tons of damage with a sudden melee hit with our guns, we are then activating the agent skill, which applies a random status effect based on the amount of damage we just dealt. Since we're dealing large amounts of damage with Executioner Blade, thus we get large amounts of dots, or even just a dot from the Executioner Blade itself, since it can apply a dot by itself. So we might even get 2 huge dots on the enemy, just allowing us to just stand by and just watch them melt, as you guys saw. Otherwise, with raid bosses, as you saw, I was able to deal large amounts of damage by just shooting. I'm not sure if Executioner Blade was proccing 100% well on the blue raid boss, like the Keeper of the Abyss, because it didn't seem to deal a ton of damage, but otherwise we were able to get a consistent damage and able to kill the raid bosses in just a few seconds otherwise. Now let's actually go over to the skill tree itself. So because of the fact we're looking to optimize our status effect damage and our melee damage, we have Potent Poisons to increase status effect damage and duration, while we have Arsenal to increase our melee damage. We also get bonuses to spell and gun damage, which does help out our build a decent bit, so that is a nice bonus as well, but the main important part we're focusing on is the melee damage. Next, we have Exploit the Weaknesses. Since we're applying some status effects on the enemy, we're going to get a damage increase for free, essentially, for every single status effect that's on the enemy, which will be up to 2 to 3 very, very easily. Because of this skill, we just get free damage, which is nice. I didn't go for Swift Death, but you could have to increase your damage by a little bit more, but I feel like the limited skill points require us to build a little bit differently, so I did not go with Swift Death, nor did I go with Follow Up. So it does say the next melee attack deals increased damage. This melee attack is only relevant to the actual swing of your weapon. So Executioner Blade does not get any bonuses from follow-up, very unfortunate, but you could run that if you wanted to melee yourself. But as I'll show in a bit, you can melee with yourself and kill enemies with one shot very easily without follow-up, so I don't think it's needed. Next, we have Shadow Step. Now the next melee attack is guaranteed critical hit whenever we kill an enemy. This does not apply to Executioner Blade. We are mainly using this as a tool to allow ourselves to melee if we ever wanted to, since we have large amounts of melee damage anyways, and every single time we hit a crit with our actual melee, we'll apply the agent ability, so that's very nice if you're going for mobbing. But overall, you don't necessarily need the skill, but it is nice to have just to deal some extra little bits of damage if you're killing lots of enemies nearby. Next, we have Nimble Fingers. This one actually does work with Executioner Blade. This just increases our fire rate and spell damage by a little bit. It's not as much as possible. You could, in theory, instead of putting 1 point in Shadow Step, put 2 points in Nimble Fingers to get more fire rate, but it's not a key seller on this build, but it is nice to have that little extra DPS increase almost constantly, since we're constantly proccing our Executioner Blade. Next, we have Sneak Attack. We're looking to deal as much damage as possible with our critical hit damage. Thus, Sneak Attack is just an obvious 5 out of 5 to have for our build. I did forget to mention that From the Shadows is what we are using. The From the Shadows allows our gun, spell, and melee to crit, and it allows Executioner Blade to crit as well, thus allowing the huge amounts of damage that you guys saw. Next, we had 3 points into this, which essentially means when we apply a status effect, it's going to spread to nearby enemies. The higher chance this is, the better, because we want to spread these status effects, or even better yet, apply a second status effect to the enemy that you're actually currently hitting, like a boss. With this skill, you can get multiple different status effects on an enemy pretty quickly, ramping up the damage of your Exploit the Weaknesses, and just overall benefiting from the core concept of this build. As I said, if there's no nearby enemies to spread to, it will apply a new status effect that has half the damage of your current status effect applied. Since we're dealing such high status effect damage, this just allows us to get an extra free DPS increase that is very significant, so make sure to optimize that. And then we have 3 out of 5 and 1,000 cuts. Now I only have 3 out of 5 and 1,000 cuts because I need to put points elsewhere. If I could have, in theory, put 5 out of 5 and 1,000 cuts without losing damage elsewhere, I would have. Next, for the Berserker tree, we have 5 out of 5 to Ancestral Frost to increase our damage with Frost, to increase our class feat damage, as well as the Frost weapons we are using on this build. We have 5 out of 5 on Savagery with our class mod giving 4 out of 5 as well, thus leading to 9 out of 5 to increase our melee damage by a whopping 36%. The old ways to increase our damage as we get closer to enemies, as well as Relentless Rage, allowing us to keep in rage even if we go into a fight for our lives, and thus allowing us to re-get it really quickly, because once we kill an enemy, we get enraged back, which is very powerful on a Berserker build. Also, it allows you to stay a little bit longer and save your soul if you so needed to, as well as having 1 point into Blast Chill with our class mod, because this then allows our Executioner Blades huge damage to then proc a huge damaging Blast Chill, which is nice. It doesn't happen that often since External Blade does have a short internal cooldown, so you can't like spam it like you'll see like 1,000 out of nowhere. You'll see like 1 every half a second, I believe, but it is still nice to have that occasional proc that just kills nearby enemies like a big AoE, which is nice. Next, on to the gear. The primary weapon I like to use is a Nightshade. Now, the reason why I like to use a Nightshade is because when you shoot it, it shoots 4 projectiles. So 1 bullet equals 4 projectiles. That means every single time you shoot with it, you have 4 chances to crit, and more chances to crit means more chances to proc Executioner Blade. So that's very important. Try to get a high pellet gun. It doesn't necessarily need to be powerful because most of your damage is going to be coming from the Executioner Blade itself. Try to get a high pellet gun, but the Nightshade is a high pellet gun and a high damaging gun at the same time, and it's Frost, so we have that. While it has Axe Skill active, increased damage dealt by 20%, which increases our melee damage of Executioner Blade. I believe it also increases our status effect damage, as well as increasing our Blast Chill with an essential double dip, so that's very nice. Next, we have a Iridescent Greysword. Now, this Iridescent Greysword, just like our Nightshade, is a purple. That means you have to get it randomly. I prefer to have a large damaging cryo weapon, and this is the highest damaging melee weapon I could find that does cryo. I believe Wailing Banshee is able to spawn in cryo, so if you find a Wailing Banshee that's cryo, that's better because of its effect, but we'll just take what we can get because the main important part, we're not really meleeing on this build, so it doesn't really matter what melee weapon you have, like what effects. What matters is that Executioner Blade gets the damage of your equipped melee weapons card text, so the higher damage of this, the more damage your Executioner Blade is going to deal, and it's going to gain the property of the element of your melee weapon. So make sure to have a appropriate melee weapon element for your type of build. Since I'm Berserker, I'm obviously going to get a ton of damage for Frost, so might as well get a Frost melee weapon to increase our damage even further. As well, for the enchantment, we have Axe Skill active, increase our elemental damage by 35%. This increases our Enraged Berserker feat damage. This increases the damage of our melee weapon and thus the damage of our Executioner Blade. This increases the damage of our Blast Chill. This increases the damage of our status effects, increases the damage of our guns. It's just a really good enchantment to have on this build, or really any build. Next, we have the Cursed Wit. Of course, we have the Cursed Wit because we get a free up to 100% increased damage while the ward is depleted. I found this to just be overall the best, so you can deal the most amount of damage with everything that's interacting while we have the enchantment. While Axe Skill is active, increase Frost damage by 50%. No brainer, we're mainly using Frost weapons. And next, we're using a Buffmeister. You don't necessarily need to use a Buffmeister on this build. I'm mainly using it for its enchantment on spell cast, increased melee damage by 30% of 10 seconds, but it is nice to have the extra speed and a tiny bit extra damage. But the main important part is having a spell that has on spell cast increased melee damage by 30% for 10 seconds. You don't necessarily need to use a Buffmeister to deal the bulk of your damage on this build, but it does really pair well with the Nightshade since it shoots 4 pellets and thus the Buffmeister applying the bonus for each pellet, but you don't necessarily need a Buffmeister. And then finally, we have the Sacrificial Scape. This just increases our survivability by a crazy amount. This has Berserker power to increase our enrage damage, thus more bonus Frost damage, as well as Frost damage on here to increase the damage of everything on our build. Next, we have the Smart Armor. Now we're going to be critting essentially all the time because we are using From the Shadows, so this really just increases our From the Shadow damage by 50% overall, and thus increasing our Executioner Blades damage by a crap ton. Make sure to have a Smart Armor on this build. If you're doing From the Shadows, Smart Armor is usually your best bet, and I have 30% Berserker power because Berserker power is the most important part on this build because because that increases their bonus frost damage. More Berserker power, the better on this build, essentially. And we have area damage to increase our blast chill damage, which is nice, as well as having gun critical hit chance, which is nice because the higher chance of critting, the more Executioner Blades we are going to see. We are getting From the Shadows back pretty quickly on this build, even though we're not having any cooldown reduction skills. From the Shadows just come back decently quick, where it doesn't necessarily matter, but it is nice to have that when you're outside of your burst window. Next, I have two identical rings here. I have melee damage on both for 15%, while they rolled melee critical hit damage twice. Normally, melee critical hit damage rolled on a ring is 12.5% on a non-chaotic or volatile. This rolled twice on this ring, which is super lucky fine. So this is giving us 25% more melee crit damage, as well as 25% melee crit damage on our second ring. So we're getting a total of 50% more melee crit damage. And since the name of the game is to crit while in From the Shadows, our Executioner Blade is going to get a free 50% more critical hit damage, thus allowing us to melt enemies very easily. And finally, here is my myth ranks. I have Druid right here. I have Archmage right here. We have Blade Master over here, as well as having Deadeye right here. And I forgot to show it in the actual video, but my hero stats are max strength, max wisdom because dot damage, as well as halfway into attunement to get our From the Shadows back. Strength equals more crit damage. You know, we're critting a lot, so that's why we have that. And then finally, the last thing to really show you is the damage of this build in a normal situation. So let's go into a Chaos Chamber and just show you how much damage this really does. Right off the bat, I like to essentially, whenever I see an enemy, is, you know, obviously start shooting, because I'm not going to be meleeing unless I see an enemy really close, and we have the skill Shadow Step up to automatically apply a critical hit. So essentially what I'm going to do is when I go into From the Shadows, I'm just going to shoot the guy a couple of times, and then the actual Executioner Blade is going to apply a huge dot on him, and thus I can just not worry about him. So essentially what you need to do on a normal mobbing situation is to go into From the Shadows, shoot the guy like a couple times, notice Executioner Blade proc, and then just run away, because then the enemy is just going to die without your, I guess really your consent. It's just going to kill the enemy without even having to be there. Now, a few moments ago, I did melee a target, but you really don't need to melee at all for this build, because all your melee damage is going to translate into Executioner Blade. Since we're shooting so many pellets, and thus allowing us to get lots and lots of crits very easily, we're seeing Executioner Blade just come out and obliterate most enemies. Even Quartz enemies die really quickly. As you see right here, he got the huge dot on him and is immediately dying. Of course, you can just melee normally like on this build, and you'll deal tons and tons of damage, as you saw right there, but you really don't need to actually ever melee with this build, because you're dealing a ton of melee damage by just shooting the enemies, and Executioner Blade really just lets you do the melee work for you. Like, here's a great example. There's a target up there, thus I can't melee him, but if I activate Executioner Blade, he will just die really quickly, just like that. The nice thing about this build as well is, since we're dealing mainly frost damage, we're going to see a lot of enemies just get frozen and thus take 3 times more frost damage, because when an enemy is frozen, they're going to take an exponentially larger amount of damage overall, which is very nice. If you see a big dot on the enemy, you can mainly just, as I showed before, leave them be and they'll die by themselves, because our dot damage is so high and we're getting large amounts of dot duration on this build overall. So once you do see a dot on the enemy, you can just leave them, walk away, they'll die like that. Even if they're a quartz badass enemy, they'll just die really easily. Of course, there might be some other weapons that you can use to allow yourself to get Executioner Blade to proc faster, because the more pellets there are, the more of a chance you are going to get the occasional Executioner Blade. I really do think that the Nightshade is an excellent choice to proc really quickly. Even if you don't have a purple Nightshade, it doesn't necessarily matter, as long as you have a Cryo Nightshade in general, because Cryo Nightshades do really deal a ton of damage in general. I think it's one of the better SMGs in the entire game. In general, just think it pairs extremely well with this build, because not only is it frost damage, it does proc the Executioner Blade very easily, and thus allowing us to deal large amounts of damage with melee, not even having to use the melee button at all. When making this build, I was thinking about potentially calling it Face Puncher's Back, but I don't think it's as ridiculous as Face Puncher, but it is really fun to be able to melee essentially without having to melee. So if you're looking to deal lots of gun damage and, you know, primarily use your gun, maybe you're the type of person that think melee is a little clunky, even though I don't think it is. Maybe this this is the build for you to deal tons and tons of melee damage. But nevertheless, I do hope you guys try this build. I think it's a lot of fun. I've had a ton of fun just seeing enemies melt with status effect damage and seeing Executioner Blades just deal large amounts of damage, as well as proccing Blast Chill. It's overall just really, really fun. I think you guys would enjoy it as well. So don't forget that there is a save file down below. But as always, a big shout out to the members who make these videos possible. We have Jace Noodles, Clairvoyant, Rick Iglesias, Super Noob, Josh Stig, 31bar70, Dorman Tazzy, and Grey Wolf. These are the people who support me as little as $5 a month. And you can also support me as little as $5 a month by clicking the link in the comment description or in the top right to become a member. The more members we have, the closer I get to becoming full-time, which means more videos for you guys. And as always, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and I hope you all have a great day. Bye-bye.
And the last shall be first to immerse in a pass out heat, facing him up with a moxie melt till he woke up drowning in tchotchke hell. War in a cave with a torch on the wall, then a window arrangement of porcelain dolls.